welcome back to Coffee Break Convos with me, your host, Heidi Melton. And today I'm so excited to have a conversation with Austin Gibble about the wheels of change, cultivating a connected, sustainable transportation network. So welcome to the podcast, Austin. I'm so excited that you're here.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. So if you could just let our audience know a little bit more about you and who you are and why you're here today.
Yeah, absolutely. So, as you mentioned, my name is Austin. I'm currently the transportation planning administrator for the city of Indianapolis, Indiana, and Marion County. And what that means is I serve as the point person for interagency coordination, development of long-range transportation plans and special projects, and ensuring that these plans and projects align with our goals and objectives as a city.
I love it. So, just to better understand what that even means, because I think some of our audience might not know, what does like a day in a life look like for you?
Sure. So just to kind of put it into perspective for people who might not be familiar with what a transportation planner does, I think most of us just kind of like get on our cars and drive on a road and just not really think about where that comes from. My job is to more or less think about what the transportation system needs to look like 10, 20, 30 years down the road.
Mm,
Where do those roads go? Where do we need capacity improvements? And additionally, when we have special projects come up, the city's always, we have an interest in promoting equitable economic development. And so I look at a lot of economic development projects through that lens of equity in transportation, and
mm.
determine if that economic development actually meets the goals and objectives of us as a city. So the next time you're driving down an interstate or riding a train or even riding your bike in a bike lane, a transportation planner at some point, um, did an analysis to make the determination that that piece of infrastructure was necessary.
Wow, that's incredible. I honestly, like you said, as just a driver on the road, or sometimes I ride my bike or walk my dog. I don't think of those things. So thank you so much for what you do because it's very important.
Thank you.
Yeah, so obviously you and I have some background in agriculture, and obviously we both now live in the city. So we're going to talk a little bit about that today, but talking more about trends in transportation that's going on. I know electrification is huge right now. So I'm curious, how is electrification of vehicles transforming the way we think about transportation and how it's impacting our environment?
Yeah, that's a great question. And this shift to EVs is also forcing us to focus on transportation generally and how our transportation network is designed. So the United States is uniquely dependent upon personal automobiles for transportation compared to our economic peers. And as a result, we have a larger share of our carbon emissions coming from transportation by similar comparison.
Mm,
So we do think, we need to electrify our car-dependent transportation system that we have now, but we also need to reshape our built environment so that being able to live without the cost burden of a car is an option. Now, transitioning to EVs itself is a bit of a challenge because cars are inherently inequitable. They require a disproportionate share of household income to go towards fuel, maintenance, car payments, insurance, and so on.
mm.
Um, Equity is a significant concern in the used vehicle market, as particularly as it pertains to electric vehicles, because these first and second generation EVs have shorter ranges and will need to be charged more often. But the populations that are most likely to purchase those used EVs are more likely to live in multifamily buildings or renter homes that don't have access to EV charging. And this is the big reason why that alongside this push for electrification, there's also a big push for walkability, bikeability, and improve public transportation services. And when these proper facilities and services are provided, can lower the household transportation costs and provide low cost, low barriers methods of mobility.
Wow. So, I honestly didn't even think about from an equitable standpoint, those first and second generation EV vehicles, coming back around full circle. So, is that kind of a part of how our like social efforts are being implemented here in India? I know that really wasn't a question we talked about, but I'm just curious, like how is that being impacted in that regard?
Yeah, so EV planning is something that we're looking into for Indianapolis. There are a few ongoing initiatives for implementation at the state level.
Mm,
One is from the Volkswagen settlement and they gave money to the state of Indiana as part of that settlement, which the state of Indiana is using to roll out high-speed electric vehicle chargers in certain locations.
okay.
And they're rolling out additional high-speed electric chargers as part of the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Program, which apportioned several million, actually several billion dollars to states, all 50 states in the US, explicitly for the creation of a national high-speed charger network. So those are two
Wow.
ongoing efforts. We do have some local efforts at the planning level that are ongoing, but we are looking into public electric vehicle charging for the city of Indianapolis to improve opportunities to charge.
Wow, that's incredible. I'm excited to see how that impacts, not only like my neighborhood that I live in, but just our state as a whole. That's really exciting. So, as far as the other ways you see transportation trends intersecting with broader societal shifts, like how is that going to be impacting like sustainability or urbanization?
Sure. So I'll touch a little bit on kind of the trends and where population is shifting to start. So right now, about 80% of the US population lives in what we call urbanized areas or metropolitan areas or cities.
Mm,
Um, that is expected to increase. So between 2010 and 2020, the number of persons living in urbanized areas in the US increased by 6.4%.
wow.
By 2050, almost 90% of Americans are going to live in cities and major metropolitan areas.
Wow.
And so these are concentrations of economic power and opportunity. And but we kind of have some continuing issues. Sprawling and exclusionary land use policies and underfunded transit have made accessing some of the opportunities that suburbs provide impossible for communities who may benefit most from that access. Um, and many suburbs are starting to shift their policies to becoming more dense and walkable, but affordable housing and expansion of public transit into walkable districts or to suburbs has been very slow to come. So we kind of see this trend of urbanization, but we're not seeing, or at least historically, our transportation systems have not been keeping up.
Wow. Well, and I know you and I both came from more of an agricultural background, growing up in a more rural area. So obviously, seeing the trend of more of a population coming to a more urbanized area, like how do you view the relationship between urban like centers and areas and the rural agricultural regions?
Yeah, so you, like you said, you and I both come from agricultural backgrounds. We're both involved in 4-H and FFA and grew up in rural Indiana. And I think what we hear or what we grew up hearing was a lot of this dichotomy of us versus them. Like those people in
Mhm.
the city, they don't get it. And people in the city kind of have the tendency to say the same way. But yeah, urban areas and rural areas have a symbiotic relationship in that urban areas are dependent upon rural areas for food, energy production, manufacturing, and transportation facilities between our cities. And cities benefit from the natural landscapes that rural areas provide, like wetlands and forests, which clean the air and water and mitigate flooding. And rural areas are dependent upon cities and metropolitan areas for consumption of agricultural goods, trade, economic and manufacturing outputs, technological research and development, higher education, and the large tax bases and tax revenues that cities provide that are then distributed to agricultural and rural communities for essential services.
Mm,
But when it comes to kind of those land use policies that I touched on earlier and requirements in the latter half of the 20th century for large lots, single family zoning, requirements for large impervious parking lots, separation of land uses, having housing over here, offices over here, commercial over here. And that requires a car to get between all of them. It has created a system in which we really gobble up valuable land that would otherwise be used for agricultural or
Mm,
natural purposes. And because they're dependent upon cars for even the shortest of trips, it really has a significant environmental impact. And so urbanism and agrarianism are really two sides of the same coin in my mind, in that both systems rely on the good stewardship of land and resources to ensure that our symbiotic relationships remain in balance and that resources are able to be effectively provided to one another. And in the adoption in the latter half of the 20th century of these policies that require resource intensive, car dependent land uses and transportation practices, that balance has been upset. And this ever expansion outward development rather than infill and community development and rural preservation has had a very real and negative impact on rural communities.
wow. So talking about that balance, how can a balanced approach in both contribute to a more holistic and sustainable future? I mean, I know that's critical, and we've talked about that over coffee a couple times.
Mm-hmm.
So, how can we take a more balanced approach with that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I touched on this quite a bit, and that land use is critical and zoning is critical. And this rethinking of how we think about land use and how we think about how our communities are designed is going to be really, really crucial in repairing some of the major issues that are facing both rural and urban communities. Denser, walkable communities take up less land, are more fiscally sustainable as they contribute more tax revenue per capita to the tax base, and therefore providing better public services at scale,
Mm,
and decrease overall transportation costs. And metropolitan areas that can curb their sprawl and prevent further encroachment into rural areas we depend on for food and natural ecosystems that act as carbon sinks is going to be very important towards restriking that balance between urban and rural communities.
so that's really interesting. And I'm kind of curious what your thoughts are on this. So, I get into debates with some of my family members that still live in rural areas about how do we do that. And I don't know, what are your thoughts on that? Like, have you guys started thinking about how that's actually going to be accomplished?
Mm-hmm. That's a great question. And different regions have taken different approaches, and a lot of it is dependent upon what local legislation allows.
Mm,
So, for example, in the Portland, Oregon metropolitan area, back in the 1970s, they adopted or they not necessarily adopted, they created a regional governance structure called Metro.
mm,
And what this did, the Metro operates parks, public transportation, and other several essential services. But what they also do is they manage what's called an urban growth boundary around the metropolitan area of Portland. And that helps curb some of the sprawl. There are a few other localities that have adopted urban growth boundaries. Lexington, Kentucky is another one. There are other approaches as well, such as incentivizing denser developments, closer coordination with suburban counterparts in order to develop coordinated land use plans. Broadly, there's various options. I don't think any one location has picked a best case solution just yet.
mm.
And we don't really have the land use tools that other cities in Canada and Europe have, where they're able to really work more easily on a metropolitan scale and curb some of that sprawl. So it's something that we're thinking about and we're trying to approach with the tools that we have in our toolbox. But it is going to require a bigger solution at some point down the road, I think.
Yeah. Well, and to kind of switch gears here, because we talked a little bit about EV vehicles, and now we're talking about sprawl, which obviously takes some form of transportation, sorry, to get there faster, but maybe not in a personal vehicle. So I want to talk a little bit about like trains and other public transit.
Sure.
With the resurgence of train travel and other, you know, forms of transportation, what shifts do you foresee in how people experience and perceive transportation here in the future?
Yeah. So I think that we will continue to see a trend that we've been seeing for several years with successive generations. So the oldest millennials, like people love to talk about millennials, they're getting into their 40s now. And so we are seeing more established transportation behaviors. So millennials continue to own cars at roughly the same rates as baby boomers and Gen X, but we drive them less, about 8 to 9% fewer miles compared to baby boomers. And we use other options like public transportation. Our generation tends to really value walkability in our neighborhoods, and we really place a high value on teleworking compared to our predecessors. Now, Amtrak, for those who don't know, that is the National Passenger Railroad Corporation. It was established in 1971 as a basically to take the burden of providing passenger service off of the private passenger railroad companies and bring it into as a federal service. So they have almost fully recovered from their ridership losses during the pandemic, and prior to 2020, we're setting ridership records. I think there's a really big appetite for passenger rail travel in the United States. And there's new legislation with the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act to try and get some of these services spun up. But I think that we're going to continue seeing some of these trends of persons still valuing having the option to have a car, but maybe using it in different contexts. Perhaps trips downtown or within the neighborhood aren't done with a car. They're done by walking or by public transportation or by biking. Not all the time, but some of the time. And I think that's something that we'll continue to see, if not accelerate.
I love that. I know we talked a little bit about like our generation and older millennials. I know I appreciate walkable communities or communities that offer public transit or even bikeable options. I think, correct me if I'm wrong, isn't Indiana like one of the best bikeable states, or at least
We
have cities with bikeable options?
Yeah, Indiana does surprisingly well in bicycling rankings. And the state of Indiana, the Department of Natural Resources, and the State Department of Transportation are really have really seen the value in that, in having a bikeable state. And they have put significant amounts of money into expanding our state trails network. And recently, the state DNR awarded us what's called the Next Level Trails grant, and that will complete a greenway that will run all the way from 42nd Street, where it will connect with the Monon to downtown Indianapolis, and run all the way up to Noblesville.
Ooh, that's exciting. I
It's
didn't
very
know that.
exciting. Yeah.
Um, I know one of my favorite things to do with friends is either walk or ride on the Monon. So to hear that the Monon is now being connected to another greenway of some kind downtown and up to Noblesville, I'm excited. So thanks for sharing that with us. You kind of mentioned or hinted at like a Jobs Act or some legislation that's coming out. What specific components of these legislation or the Job Act do you believe will have the most profound impact on transportation and why?
That's
And
a good
maybe tell
question.
us a little bit about those because I don't know, I don't even know if I know much about it.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. So the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act was passed, I guess it's almost been about 2 years
Wow.
at this point. That was the big bipartisan infrastructure bill that everyone was talking about for a while. So that has passed. It is now law. There is funding. I think that the biggest impacts are going to be things that people don't see. They're going to be the bridge repairs, the roadway repairs, the work at airports. However, when in terms of tangible things that people will see and tangible changes, there are some pretty big line items in there for public transit expansion, intercity rail expansion, new transportation options, a focus and equity in our transportation investments to ensure that it uplifts the communities who are most in need, and really try to lift people out of poverty through
Mm.
investments in equitable transportation systems development.
I love that. I know, especially here in Indianapolis, there's so many different areas that could definitely be positively impacted in legislation like this. So I'm excited to see how our public transportation not only expands, but also improves. Which I know, I can't remember when it was passed, and maybe you can tell us. But when the red line was passed, and then it obviously started construction, and now there's even more improvements happening. Do you know much about that?
Yeah, so there's actually a whole saga behind that.
You're like, probably not enough time to talk about that saga today.
Yes, I actually started back on working on that when I was an intern, and so
Wow,
I've had the pleasure of seeing that project go from an idea on a board to reality.
that's amazing.
But what happened is that in 2016, a referendum was presented to Marion County voters, and it said, "Would you like the city to have the power to enact a 0.25% income tax that would go exclusively to public transportation services?"
Mhm.
That passed pretty handily at the ballot box, just shy of 60% voted yes.
Wow.
And so that tax went into effect. And as you noted, we opened our first rapid transit line, and we use a technology called bus rapid transit. And for your listeners who may not be familiar with what bus rapid transit is, it's like build all of the components of light rail. You have a dedicated running way, stations, ticketing, and then you just take out the tracks.
Hmm.
And same thing. So the bus has its own running way. The bus is all electric. It's got pre-board ticketing, and it's got a platform that's level with the floor of the bus. The experience is like a train in most ways. So that opened the first line, the north-south spine, the red line, opened in 2019. The next line, which we call the purple line, will go out to the far east side and serve the largest concentration of zero-car households and low-income households in the city. That is due
Wow.
to open next year. And then
Open as in start construction, or open as like you can start writing it?
as you can start writing it, it is under
Wow.
construction now.
I had no idea. That's awesome.
Yes. So for your indie listeners, if you go out on East 38th Street right now, it's currently under construction. And and then the blue line, that'll be the third and final line of the plan system, which will run from the Indianapolis International Airport through downtown and to the east side in Cumberland. Um,
Mm.
and these projects additionally are much more than transit. It's, for example, East 38th Street was built largely before Marion County had development standards, or before the city and county merged in 1970 to build those or to establish those development standards.
Mhm.
So these major thoroughfares were built without sidewalks. They were built
Oh,
without
wow.
bike paths. They were built without adequate drainage. So people were standing in deep water waiting for the bus. People were frequently getting hit on East 38th Street because there was no infrastructure to accommodate them. But
Wow.
the purple line will come with new bike paths, sidewalks for the entire length of the route, full connectedness throughout the neighborhoods. It's very exciting and very transformational for these neighborhoods to have this infrastructure come in after decades of disinvestment.
That's amazing. To be quite frank with you, I didn't realize just how vast that project really was. And to hear not only the development that's coming to these neighborhoods and these communities, but that it's really creating opportunity for business growth, education access, and economic access. I mean, this is going to be huge for our community, and I'm really excited. And you got to be a part of it from start to basically finish. I mean, incredible. Congratulations on that.
Oh, thank you. I was
Yeah,
excited to be
absolutely.
part of it.
Well, I can't believe that you literally started it as an intern. So that's really cool to hear. So kind of wrapping up today because we're getting close on time. So I want to ask a couple more questions. And maybe we just shift into more like talking about sustainable pathways and here in Indianapolis, because I think a lot of our listeners here in Indianapolis will appreciate that. First, you talked to me about over coffee a thing called Thrive Indianapolis. First, tell us what Thrive Indianapolis is, and then how does this Thrive Indianapolis sustainability plan take transportation into account and work towards a more environmentally friendly future?
Yeah. So the Thrive Indianapolis plan, or what we just call the Thrive plan in the office, it actually comes from our Office of Sustainability. But transportation is a key component of Thrive. So aside from buildings, transportation is our second largest source of greenhouse gas emissions in Marion County. It is
Wow.
huge. The goal of the Thrive Plan, or the stated goals and objectives of the Thrive Plan, is to get Indianapolis down to net zero carbon emissions by 2050. And without significant changes to our transportation network, that's going to be very difficult to achieve. So broadly, the plan works closely with our transit authority, known as Indigo, and really leans into some of the land use and zoning changes that we've been making to encourage growth around transit. One, to mitigate that sprawl that I was talking about earlier, but also to really foster organic neighborhood activity and really encourage people by choice, and giving people additional options to walk, to bike, to more easily use public transportation. Broadly, the plan, through Thrive and Indy Moves, which is our part of our comprehensive plan, and the transportation plan. The goal is to give people more options and to make walking, cycling, public transit easy options and easy choices to use.
I love that. I never realized it was a part of a sustainability plan. And a lot of our listeners have a background in sustainability, and I know that they'll be excited to talk a little bit more about that. So, tell us a little bit more about the goals as far as Thrive. Like, what does that look like in regards to really changing the overall environment for our community here in Indianapolis?
Sure. So Thrive is designed to do kind of exactly what we discussed earlier in our interview, and encourage population growth and development on our transit corridors rather than out on our fringes. And the city recently made some pretty significant milestones in achieving those goals. In 2021, we passed what's called a transit-oriented development overlay. And this is a design-based overlay that we conducted an analysis for along our bus rapid transit corridors and determined that these small amounts of land in Marion County along these corridors produce a dramatically outsized portion of our tax revenues. And so it's
Wow.
basically, we're saying this land is highly valuable and it's currently
Mhm.
being underutilized, and we should leverage this to the best of our abilities to encourage neighborhood development, to encourage population growth, and to encourage tax revenue growth in an efficient manner so that we can develop and deliver higher quality public services. There are also other goals within the Thrive Plan. For example, we actually just recently reached a goal of planting a certain number of trees. I cannot remember the number, I apologize, but we recently achieved that goal early, and we are continuing to push forward with tree plantings. And while tree plantings may sound a little basic when it comes to environmental sustainability in the built environment, trees are really, really important for reducing the burden on our storm sewer system, because trees just suck up so much water and they keep it out of the drainage network.
Mm.
Additionally, they are resilience tools for neighborhoods. Part of this analysis in Thrive that we conducted determined which neighborhoods are the least resilient, who is likely to be most impacted by extreme rain, heat, snow. And trees are important for reducing those heat impacts. And we found that the lowest income neighborhoods and those who are most vulnerable also have the least amount of tree coverage in their neighborhoods. They
Mm.
are the most likely to be impacted by extreme heat. And by planting additional trees and planting them now as things get hotter, we can create an urban tree canopy that can help mitigate some of those heat effects.
Wow. you don't really think about trees in that way as far as like helping our sewage system. You kind of just think of it more of like providing more oxygen to our earth. Like I think that's the way I think of trees being planted in the city. So that's really great to hear of how we're basically providing more options for our neighbors. I do have a question though. This is like totally off the rails here, but it was kind of an idea that a German friend of mine had. She was like, she had asked me, she said, why does the US not plant more fruit bearing trees? So that way, like our neighbors that maybe come from less have affordability for food, but now with these fruit bearing trees have access to a social outlet for free food options. And I said, that's a great question. I don't know. Do you know why we don't have fruit bearing trees?
I don't,
Yeah,
unfortunately. I mean, I have some friends who have one. I think largely it's just most property in Indianapolis is private and it's dependent on who
mm,
plants. But and obviously some fruit bearing trees like citrus plants wouldn't exactly do well here, but
sure.
apples do well here. Pawpaws are a local favorite.
Yeah.
By all
Well, I was
means, I
just
encourage people to please plant fruit bearing trees.
yeah, yeah. I was just thinking about that too. And when you were talking about trees, I was like, oh, that was actually a great conversation that she and I had. And I think from an equitable standpoint, that could be a great idea, maybe even just in like certain parks or certain corners of our city that we could think about for the future. Well, we're coming up on time, and I always ask all of our guests on the show the last two questions. So the first one I want to ask you are, what are the three takeaways you want our listeners to walk away with today?
Sure. Well, one is the urban and rural, and urbanism and agrarianism being two sides of the same coin. Um, and I think that we have a very terrible us versus them mentality when it comes to
Mm,
cities and agricultural communities. And what I want people to take away is that it's we are two sides of the same coin. We all have shared interests and goals, and we all want healthy communities and to ensure that good stewardship of land protects our environment, our neighborhoods, and our food systems for generations to come. So I really encourage people to think about that symbiotic relationship rather than this kind of like us versus them narrative.
mm,
Um,
I love that.
a second thing to take away really is to try and think more holistically about the population in your work. No matter what you do, I think you should always have the most vulnerable person in mind. When you're doing your
Mm,
work, always think about like who could potentially be negatively impacted, and think about methods to either mitigate those negative impacts or find solutions and work with the community to find mitigations for impacts. Um, and then third, love the community you're in. I know that can be very difficult. And I think those of us who are urbanists in the United States it can be very challenging. This is a very hard uphill battle to fight when it comes to dramatically rethinking how we think about transportation, not just in cities, but for rural communities as well. We didn't really get into it very much, but rural communities are struggling with the same transportation issues that urban communities are struggling with. They've seen cuts to Amtrak and losses of these connections to cities and the resources that cities provide. And we've also seen a significant degradation of our bus system nationally. Um, and so it's it's really difficult to have a positive outlook when some things have gotten so bad over the decades from deindustrialization and deinvestment, or disinvestment rather. But it's important to continue loving your community and fighting for your community and fighting for improvements every day. Otherwise, what do you have to fight for?
yeah, I love that. Well, I think that's definitely something that all of our listeners can take away from our conversation is whether we live in a city or out in a rural space, we're really on the same coin and we're working towards the same things no matter where we live. And then, at the end of the day, we've got to love love where we're at. I love those key takeaways from our conversation. I really appreciate you hopping on with us today and having this interview. It's been a lot of fun. And my last question that I love to ask all of our guests that come on the show is, in your space and in your industry, who is someone that you admire and why?
Oh, that's such a hard question. There's so many people who are doing so much good. Um, but I think I'd have to give a shout out to my friend. His name is Jerome. We worked together here in Indy for quite some time, working together at Indigo and bringing some of these transit projects to fruition. He has since moved to New York and is working for a nonprofit to really elevate the transit and transportation conversation nationally. And he is absolutely killing it. And so he's someone that I really admire for really just going after it and not being afraid to make his voice heard.
That's awesome. Well, hopefully we can all be inspired by Jerome and letting our voices be heard in whatever industry we're in. So thank you again, Austin, for coming on to Coffee Break Convos and having this great conversation with me today. And I hope that you'll definitely come on again in the future.
Absolutely. I'm happy to come on at any time. Thank you for
Awesome.
having me.
Absolutely. Well, thank you guys. Bye.